Hello and welcome to the All Nations Church Bangkok podcast. This week we're really grateful to have Reverend Anup sharing with us from Exodus 34 verses 6 to 7. I pray this podcast blesses you. If you enjoy the episode, please do subscribe and share with your friends. God bless you.
Hello and shalom to everyone listening to this podcast. I am Reverend Anup Rai, and the title of my sermon today is Tell Me a Bit About Yahweh. My sermon today is inspired by a lecture given to me by Dr. John Oswald in one of my classes at Asbury Theological Seminary, where I sat and thought to myself, I have been a believer for a good 35 years, and I have never been taught about this. What really got to me that day as I was listening to his lecture was just how many times Exodus 34 verses 6 and 7 has been used in other Old Testament books. Exodus 34 verses 6 and 7 reads, "And he passed in front of Moses," talking about Yahweh, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Today we are going to look at mainly at verse 6. But before that, let me make a quick remark regarding verse 7. It says here that Yahweh does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generations. But what about his love? What does it say about him forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin? It says that's for thousands of generations. There is no end to his love. Let me start by telling you an incident that happened to me. One day, after I preached a sermon, a lady came up to me. She was a mother, and she said to me, "Pastor, I don't know how to teach the Old Testament to my children." Has anybody said something similar to you about the Old Testament? Or maybe you have thought something along those lines as you are trying to read the Old Testament? Any regular Bible reader sooner or later probably wrestles with similar questions. Now, don't worry, you are not alone if you have had such thoughts. The vast timeline, the history the Old Testament covers, the uncountable names that are mentioned, the violence in it, all these things have posed challenges for Bible readers. Sometimes even making Christians stop reading the Old Testament. Or sometimes some Christians find Old Testament so hard to understand, they just turn back to the New Testament and start reading. But I want to say two problems that might come when we ignore the Old Testament. First, in the 2nd century, there was a man named Marcion. The church fathers proclaimed him as a heretic because what he said and believed was that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament was a totally different God. He said the God of the Old Testament was a God of wrath, a merciless God. In contrast, the God of the New Testament was a God of love and mercy. Sometimes Christians can find themselves in danger of thinking along those lines when we ignore the Old Testament. Some Christians even might believe that God somehow shifted and became more gracious. But at the core of our Christian faith is the understanding of who God is, isn't it? A God who is a triune God. Yes, different persons, but same in essence, having the exact nature and character. The second problem when we ignore the Old Testament is that we don't get to know who Yahweh is. What's He like? If you ask me, tell me something about your wife or your children, I will be able to tell you a lot about them. My children are young enough that I might be able to tell you more about them than they themselves realize. So we do need to know our God, don't we? The God we worship. So how do we know more about this God? Yahweh, as the Israelites would say. Let's take a quick trip to learn a bit about Yahweh. Come with me. I think the best way to know more about Yahweh is to meet the Israelites who knew Yahweh very closely. Imagine for a second if you could meet the Israelites in a coffee shop. You get to have your Americano or a regular latte, and Moses and the Israelites are sitting next to you. Now you could ask them any question. What would your question be? I know I didn't give you a heads up and you might not have your question prepared. Don't worry, let me help you come up with a question. I think one good question you could ask them is like, tell me a bit about Yahweh. Does He get easily angered like they say? What's He like? Is He gracious? Is He merciful? Tell me anything. You know, the Israelites would probably stare at you and they would take their Bible or Torah in their hand. Actually, they probably have memorized it, and they would say, silly you. That's why you shouldn't have skipped reading the Old Testament. And then they would turn to or recite, I think, Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, and they would say, the Lord, our Yahweh, He is compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. And they would say, did you really not notice how many times these have been mentioned in the Old Testament about who our Yahweh is? At least 8 more times, Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7 has been reused in other Old Testament books. Some would argue that it's been quoted more than 20 times. And these verses tell us about who Yahweh is. A loving God. Well, when we read this about Yahweh, about who He is, it sounds a lot like Jesus, doesn't it? A God who is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. So Marcion got it totally wrong. Yes, this is what the Old Testament is trying to convey to us. That Jesus and Father are one. John 10:30. Jesus says at one point, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Meaning there exists a koinonia, a fellowship between the Father and Jesus. There is a complete unity between the two, which is beyond comparison. The speeches and actions of Jesus are the speeches and actions of the Father, and vice versa. So when I was in my seminary, at Asbury Theological Seminary, I got an incredible privilege to learn some Hebrew, the language that the Old Testament was written in. So what I would like to do is take you on a quick Hebrew 101 class on these words. Now we should realize that most words cannot be translated in a one-to-one translation, and words are better understood in its context. But I would like to take a quick tour and just see how these words are used overall in the Old Testament. So we know how we get to Exodus 34. In Exodus 19, Moses goes to make a covenant with Yahweh. And in Exodus 32, when Moses comes down, Aaron and the Israelites are found making an idol. And then we get to Exodus 34, where Moses wants to plead to God and asks for forgiveness. So let's look at these words. Number one description of Yahweh here, it says, is compassionate. The Hebrew word used is rahum. English Bibles translate it as compassionate or merciful. Now this word, rahum, is related to a mother's womb. It's a tender love of a mother toward her children. As someone who's married to an incredibly amazing mother to my children, I get to see each day how she cares for my children. Also, having been raised by a single mother, I have been blessed to experience a glimpse of God's rahum, compassion. Now, what does that mean for us? It means that this merciful God genuinely cares for us. Not for an hour, nor for a day, month, but He constantly shows compassion to us. He does not have a hard heart towards us. Sometimes, you see in this world parents abandoning their children. Sometimes you see people who only care about themselves. Some people's heart says, me, and more me. But our Yahweh is nothing of that sort. Instead, He is merciful. He is kind. Some people, might say, well, isn't the whole point of being a God is to be able to do whatever He wants, to show His power, to do whatever pleases Him without considering anything else? Not for our Yahweh. Our Yahweh is compassionate. He is kind, and He cares for us. The number 2 description here of Yahweh is gracious. In Hebrew, the word used is chanun. This is a description of Yahweh that we are familiar with, a gracious God, meaning He does things for us, things that we are really undeserving of. See, we humans are so used to this idea of returning good for good and bad for bad, aren't we? Well, if God acted with us that way, we would have no chance. But our Yahweh, He is gracious. He does not give us what we deserve. And that's not all. Surprisingly, He gives us good gifts that are beyond what we deserve and even expect. That is exactly what the Israelites experienced, isn't it? As Israel continued time and again to reject the commandments of Yahweh and worshipped and even created other gods, what did Yahweh do? Every time they would ask for forgiveness, He was gracious to them and forgave them. The same unchanging God grants us the favor to us today, of which we are actually not worthy. Number 3 description of Yahweh is slow to anger. The Hebrew phrase used is arech afayim, which literally can be translated as long nose or long off nose. Out of the 5 descriptions of God, this is my favorite one. People have tried to make a picture of God. Apparently, all of those pictures are a failure, because I have never seen a picture of God with a long nose. What a description of God. The idea here the Hebrews are trying to tell us is, when we get angry, we sniff, something like that, and the person's nose turns red. It's that imagery. But in the case of our Yahweh, He has a long nose. It takes a long time for the anger to get to the tip of His nose. Now, to the question of whether God gets angry, of course He does. With love comes anger, doesn't it? I'm sorry, but my kids and my wife, They are the ones who I love the most, but also see my angry side the most. Yes, there are people with anger issues, but that's not in the picture here. What the message here is that as a father, God gets angry at us when we go against His commandment. So yes, God does get angry, but He is love. I always tell my kids, but as for me, I have a short nose, literally and figuratively. It is easy for me to get angry and frustrated. But I have to remind my kids time and again that God has a long nose, meaning He is patient with us, even in our failure and mistake. He keeps pursuing us. Number 4 description of Yahweh is love. The word in Hebrew is chesed. This is a key word in the Old Testament, but it's a hard one to translate. The Hebrew word chesed is a premium expression of Yahweh's character and nature. In the Old Testament, it has been used about 250 times. It's been translated as mercy, grace, love, kindness, goodness. But maybe the best way to understand it is in terms of covenant faithfulness. Now think of the Israelites rescued by Yahweh. They were not very dependable, were they? But what would Yahweh do? He always kept His side of the promise, even when Israel was unfaithful to Him. That is God's chesed. However fickle and unreliable humans may be in their relationship with God and each other, Yahweh is nothing of that kind. Instead, Yahweh can be counted on to be completely true to His promises for His people in every situation and all times. The 5th and last description of Yahweh here is faithfulness. The Hebrew word is emet. The word in the English, truth, meaning Yahweh is trustworthy. He can be totally dependent on, and He is consistently faithful. See, in this world, we will meet many unfaithful and undependable people. But our earthly experiences, human bad experiences, should not be compared to our Heavenly Father, who is faithful. He can be relied on every issue. He can be utterly trusted, even on issues of life and death. You can trust Him with your life. He knows what's best for you. Did you know that He knows what's best for you more than you do? Many times I don't know what's best for me. But that's a good news that I have a God who knows what's best for me. A God who knows more than I know myself. But even so more is that this God who knows me more than I know myself wants the best for me. I'm ready to give my life to this God. Are you? That if we give our life to this God, our lives are in safe hands. Hands that hold the world now is ready to hold your and my life. What about death? You know, a few years ago, I lost my sister to breast cancer. Man, life can be brutal sometimes, can't it? It hits us hard sometimes. And if we live long enough, sooner or later, we will have difficulties come to us. And we might have questions, why doesn't God take away the pain of the world? Why does this good God let evil exist in the world if He is able to take it away? I mean, these are real questions we face. But you know, when my sister passed away My family and I had a very hard time because she was still very young. She was only 34. But after a year or so, I reflected and I thought to myself, man, as Christians, we have this assured hope. I know in my heart that I will see her again, that she is now with Jesus, and that death does not have a final say in a believer's life. There is more. Yes, friends, we can trust Him with our life, but also in death. So we have a good God, don't we? As I come to the end of this sermon, let's go back to the coffee shop where we met the Israelites. I mean, we have to say goodbye to them. And as the discussion goes on, you ask them, you tell them, well, all these words you have said sounds good. They sound truly promising. But how can we know for sure that these things are true about Yahweh? Can you give me more proof? Can you help me see more clearly? The Israelites might say to you, just look at the cross. Yahweh sent His only Son for you. Now, I'm a father of 3 kids, and let me tell you, I'm an earthly, selfish person. But I don't know if I could send my son to be crucified. But this Yahweh loves us so much that He would do so. He does good things for us, doesn't He? See, look at the cross. Even at His own expense, He does things for us, even if it's not for His own benefit. He would give us everything. He would give His Son away to die the most horrible death so that we can have life, so that we can have a relationship with Him. So my friends, next time somebody asks you, tell me a bit about Yahweh, please tell them, Yahweh, my God, He is compassionate. He is gracious. He is slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. God bless you all.